The breech slams shut on the third round, and the sergeant is already screaming to limber the gun. Hands that should be loading grab trails instead. The spotter abandons his position before the shell even lands downrange. 4 men heave a 105mm howitzer onto its carriage, while the gunner sprints for the half-track, and the whole crew, veterans of 3 years on the Eastern Front, moves like they've got 30 seconds to live. They have less. The position they're abandoning sits on a ridge overlooking the Leary Valley, January 1944. Perfect defilade, pre-surveyed firing points, rock walls thick enough to stop anything short of a direct hit. German artillery doctrine says, hold the high ground, establish observation, and pulverize the enemy at leisure. These men have done exactly that across Russia and North Africa, then again in Sicily. They know how to fight from terrain like this, so why are they running? The half-track lurches forward before the last man clears the tailgate. The howitzer bounces wildly behind them on the frozen road. They don't slow down. They don't look back. They drive 500 meters to a secondary position they surveyed yesterday. A position they'll fire from exactly twice before abandoning that one too. Behind them, the ridge erupts. Not one shell, not a ranging shot. 16 rounds land within 4 seconds, bracketing the spot where their gun sat moments ago. The rock walls that should have protected them become shrapnel. The ammunition they couldn't load fast enough cooks off in a pillar of orange flame, visible for miles. If they'd stayed another 45 seconds, the time it would take to fire 3 more rounds, they'd be dead. A German battery commander near Cassino would later write that his men developed what he called Abschussticks, firing ticks, involuntary flinches. The moment they pulled the lanyard, half the crew was already looking for cover, not because they feared counterfire eventually, because they knew counterfire was coming now, measured in heartbeats rather than minutes. How does artillery, the weapon that dominated European battlefields since Napoleon, become a death sentence for the men who fire it? What system could possibly locate a gun, calculate firing solutions, and deliver massed shells to a pinpoint target faster than trained crews could reload? And why did the Germans, who invented modern combined arms doctrine, have absolutely nothing that could match it? The answer isn't one weapon. It's not even one innovation. It's an entire American approach to killing artillery that turned every German gun flash into a confession and every muzzle blast into a death warrant. By 1944, German artillery crews in Italy weren't fighting the American army. They were fighting a machine, a system of observation aircraft, sound-ranging microphones, flash detection observers, radio networks, pre-plotted fire missions, and battalions of American guns that could mass fires faster than any military in history. The Germans called it Artillerieüberfall, artillery ambush. They used that word because it captured something their doctrine had no answer for. The ambush came from everywhere at once, and it came for whoever shot first. Every year, there are fewer people left who remember what this sounded like: the crack of outgoing fire, then silence, then the sky falling. A like and a subscribe keeps these stories in front of new eyes. If someone in your family served in the artillery, Allied or Axis, put their unit in the comments. That's history that belongs on the record. Monte Cassino should have been a German artillery victory. The terrain favored defense absolutely. The monastery dominated observation in every direction. American forces were attacking uphill, across open ground, against prepared positions manned by some of the best German divisions in Italy. Every tactical manual ever written said the defenders should win the artillery duel. Instead, German gun crews learned to shoot and scoot like hunted animals. Fire 3 rounds, displace, fire 2 more, displace again. Stay in one position too long, and the Americans triangulate you. Fire enough rounds to establish a pattern, and they predict your next shot. Assume you have time, and you're already dead. A captured German officer, interrogated after Cassino, described American counter-battery work as industrialized murder. That wasn't an insult. It was technical assessment. The Americans had industrialized it, taken the chaos of finding and killing enemy guns and turned it into a production line. Observation went in one end. Dead artillery crews came out the other. To understand how they built that machine and why the Germans couldn't copy it, we have to go back to what the American Army learned in the trenches of 1918 and the doctrine it spent 20 years perfecting in the peacetime that followed. 1917. The Meuse Argonne. An American forward observer crouches in a shell crater with a field telephone, wire running back through 300 yards of mud to a battalion headquarters that may or may not still exist. His job is to find German guns. He has binoculars, a compass, a map printed 6 months ago from aerial photographs taken 8 months before that, and whatever he can see through the smoke and rain and constant explosions that turn the horizon into a wall of brown and gray. A German battery opens fire somewhere to his northeast. He sees the flash, maybe. He estimates the range, roughly. He calls back coordinates that are accurate to within, optimistically, 400 yards. The Fire Direction Center receives his report, plots it against 2 other observer reports that contradict his by significant margins, averages the estimates, calculates a firing solution by hand, telephones it to a battery 3 miles to the rear, and waits while gun crews crank elevation wheels and traverse their pieces. 43 minutes after the German guns first fired, American shells land in their general vicinity. The German battery has already displaced twice. The shells kill nothing but French farmland that stopped being farmland 2 years ago. This was counter-battery fire for most of military history. Not precision, probability. You knew enemy guns were out there somewhere. You knew roughly where. You saturated the area with enough shells that statistics eventually caught up with them. The French called it zone fire and considered anything within 500 meters of a target acceptable accuracy. The Germans refined it with better optics and superior survey techniques, but the fundamental problem remained. By the time you located a gun, calculated the solution, and delivered the rounds, that gun had either moved or finished its mission. Counter-battery wasn't about killing guns. It was about suppressing them, making crews duck, slowing their rate of fire. Actual destruction required either luck or such enormous expenditure of ammunition that you'd win eventually through sheer weight of metal. The numbers tell the story. British artillery studies from the Somme calculated that destroying a single enemy battery required an average of 1,600 rounds of sustained fire over multiple days. German analysis from Verdun suggested even worse ratios, 2,000 rounds per confirmed kill under optimal conditions, conditions that almost never existed. Sound ranging and flash detection improved the odds. Aerial observation helped when aircraft could survive long enough to report. But every improvement ran into the same wall: communication delay. Information moved at the speed of telephone wire and human calculation. A forward observer could watch a German gunfire, but by the time his report traveled back through the system, got processed, got transmitted to firing batteries, got translated into aiming data, and resulted in outgoing shells, the window had closed. Artillery crews learned this rhythm. They understood they had time. Fire a mission, displace if convenient, set up again somewhere else. The enemy might eventually find your new position, but eventually meant hours or days, not seconds. German artillerymen who survived the Eastern Front had 3 years of this calculus burned into their bones. Soviet counter-battery existed. The Red Army had plenty of guns, but it operated on World War I timelines with World War I accuracy. A German battery could fire 30 rounds from a position before displacement became urgent. 50 rounds if they were dug in well. Soviet sound-ranging equipment, when it worked at all, took upward of 20 minutes to triangulate a fix. Soviet communication networks ran on runners and couriers as often as radios. Soviet fire direction relied on paper charts and manual computation that added more delay at every step. German gun crews respected Soviet artillery the way professionals respect any large-caliber weapon pointed in their general direction. But they didn't fear the counter-battery response specifically. The system was too slow. The margins were too wide. You could work within those margins if you knew what you were doing. So when these same crews arrived in Italy to face the Americans, they brought assumptions forged in a different war. They expected the old rules: fire a mission, observe the impact, adjust, fire again, displace when the position gets hot, which might be hours from now, might be never, if the position is good enough. They'd heard rumors about American industrial capacity. Everyone had. But industry meant tanks and planes and landing craft. Nobody had warned them that the Americans had industrialized the counter-battery problem itself, that somewhere behind those lines sat a machine that could turn a single muzzle flash into a grid coordinate in under 90 seconds and mass the fires of a dozen batteries on that coordinate before the German crews finished reloading. The first time they fired, and the sky fell on them inside 2 minutes, some of them probably assumed it was coincidence, bad luck. Random American shells landing on their position by chance. Then it happened again, and again. And they began to understand that the war they'd learned how to fight no longer existed. The vibration comes first. A low pulse through the frozen Italian soil, traveling at roughly 1,100 feet per second, the speed of sound through compacted earth. 3 miles behind American lines, a technician wearing headphones jerks upright in his chair. The needle on his oscillograph scratches a sharp spike onto rolling paper tape. He marks the time to the 10th of a second, checks the bearing indicated by the directional array, and reaches for his field telephone. Somewhere out there, a German gun just fired. The technician doesn't know which gun. He doesn't know the caliber. He doesn't need to. His job is to record the exact moment that sound wave hit his microphone array and pass that timestamp up the chain. 6 other arrays spread across a baseline of 4,000 yards are doing the same thing simultaneously. Sound ranging had existed since 1915. The British developed the first practical systems on the Western Front, burying microphones in geometric patterns and using the time differences between sound arrivals to triangulate gun positions. The mathematics were straightforward. The same principles surveyors used for decades. But British sound ranging in the Great War suffered from the same delays as everything else. Readings went to a central post for manual calculation. Results got telephoned to artillery headquarters. Firing solutions emerged minutes or hours later. The Americans rebuilt it from scratch. By 1943, American sound-ranging sections operated as integrated units with pre-computed charts. The baseline microphones fed directly into a plotting room, where operators used sliding scales and prepared tables to convert time differentials into grid coordinates without extended calculation. A trained crew could produce a firing solution within 3 minutes of detecting a hostile discharge. 3 minutes. The German gun crew was still swabbing their bore. Flash observation ran in parallel. Different physics, same result. Observers positioned on elevated terrain, hills, church steeples, occasionally aircraft, watch for the distinctive muzzle flash of artillery discharge. Two observers watching the same flash from different positions could cross their bearing lines on a map and produce a fix. Daytime flashes were harder to spot. Nighttime flashes were unmistakable. German crews learned to fire only in daylight when they could, which reduced their effectiveness by roughly half and still didn't save them, because the sound-ranging crews didn't need to see anything. Then, the forward observers. These men sat in shell holes and ruined buildings within direct sight of German positions, equipped with something the Germans consistently underestimated: FM radios that actually worked, not the temperamental vacuum tube sets that plagued European armies, but ruggedized American designs, mass-produced by Motorola and Galvin, with tolerances built for mud and cold and rough handling. A forward observer could watch a German battery fire, call the grid coordinates by voice, and have that information in the fire direction center before the German shell landed on its target. The British had tried something similar in North Africa. Networked observation posts linked by radio to artillery batteries for rapid response. It worked sometimes. The radios failed in heat. The batteries couldn't mass fires fast enough. The communication architecture assumed one observer talking to one battery, rather than multiple observers feeding a central brain that could coordinate dozens of guns. By El Alamein, the British had improved significantly, but they never achieved the integration density the Americans would bring to Italy. 3 independent systems. Any one of them could locate a German gun. All 3 operating simultaneously meant redundancy and cross-verification. False positives got eliminated before they reached the target list. If sound ranging detected a discharge at grid coordinate X and flash observation confirmed hostile activity at the same coordinate, and a forward observer reported the bearing matched his visual, that was a confirmed fix. The Fire Direction Center sat at the convergence point. Reports from all 3 detection networks flowed into a single room where trained plotters maintained a constantly updated map of suspected and confirmed enemy positions. When multiple sources agreed on a location, the fix got upgraded from suspected to active. Active positions went to the top of the target list. The German gun crew that fired those 3 rounds near the Liri Valley never saw any of this. They saw Italian hills and American positions and what looked like a conventional front. They had no way of seeing the microphones buried in the soil 3 miles away, or the observer on the ridgeline 4 kilometers south, marking their muzzle flash on his plotting board. The forward observer 200 yards from their position, whispering coordinates into a handset the size of a brick. They never knew he was there. What they saw, what they experienced, was their third round leaving the tube and the sky beginning to scream 90 seconds later. Detection meant nothing without speed. The Germans had sound-ranging equipment, flash observers, forward artillery spotters with binoculars, and maps just like everyone else. What they didn't have was the ability to turn that information into shells on target before the enemy guns went silent. The Fire Direction Center wasn't an American invention in the sense of creating something new from nothing. It was an American solution to a problem every army recognized, but nobody else solved. How do you mass fires from multiple batteries onto a single target without each battery commander doing his own calculations? How do you compress the time between gun spotted and gun dead from half an hour to half a minute? The answer looked like a converted supply tent full of men hunched over plotting boards. Inside an FDC, information arrived continuously. Radio operators wearing headsets scribbled coordinates on message pads and passed them to plotters. The plotters maintained a master map showing every friendly battery, every suspected enemy position, every pre-registered target point. When a confirmed fix came in, German gun at grid reference such and such, the FDC didn't telephone individual battery commanders and ask them to calculate their own firing solutions. The FDC computed everything centrally, then transmitted ready-to-use data to however many batteries the mission required. Elevation, deflection, charge, fuse setting. The gun crews didn't think. They received numbers, cranked their pieces to match, and pulled lanyards. A battery that might take 4 minutes to compute its own solution could receive FDC data and fire in under 60 seconds. Now multiply that across 6 batteries, or 12, or every gun in a division artillery. The Germans understood massed fires in theory. Their doctrine emphasized concentration of effect, bringing multiple batteries to bear on critical targets. But German artillery coordination required extensive planning. Battery commanders had to agree on target reference points, synchronize watches, establish communication protocols, and compute their own data from shared information. This worked for prepared bombardments, scheduled fires against known positions at predetermined times. It failed completely for reactive fires against fleeting targets. By the time German batteries coordinated a massed response to an unexpected threat, that threat had moved or accomplished its mission. American FDCs made massed fires routine, no special coordination required, nothing exceptional about it. A division artillery S3 could pick up a radio handset, designate a target, specify the number of batteries to engage, and have rounds in the air from guns spread across miles of front within 2 to 3 minutes. The German crew that fired its 3 rounds had no idea how many American guns were about to respond. The answer was frequently all of them. One FMS report compiled after the war documented a German officer's attempt to understand what he'd faced. His unit had engaged American positions near Anzio with a battery of 4 guns, standard harassing fire, a few rounds, nothing special. Within 90 seconds, return fire arrived, not from one battery, from what he estimated as 36 to 40 guns simultaneously. The shells landed in a pattern so tight, he initially assumed they'd pre-registered the position, that the Americans had somehow known exactly where his battery would set up. They hadn't. They detected his first round, computed solutions for every available battery, transmitted the data, and coordinated the salvo in less time than it took his loaders to prepare the second shell. The officer's word for this was unheimlich, uncanny, the word Germans use for things that violate the natural order. What made it possible wasn't genius. It was arithmetic done faster. American artillerymen trained on firing tables until the calculations became reflex. FDC plotters practice coordination drills until the sequence of receive, plot, compute, transmit required no conscious thought. Radio operators knew their frequencies and protocols cold. Every step that could be pre-computed was pre-computed. Every delay that could be eliminated was eliminated. The Germans had excellent guns and training, solid doctrine for the war they'd been fighting. The Americans had a system optimized for one specific purpose: killing the men who shot at them before those men could shoot again. Speed was the weapon. Everything else was delivery mechanism. A German battery needed roughly 8 minutes to displace under ideal conditions, limber the guns, load the vehicles, drive to the secondary position, unlimber, relay the pieces, resume firing. American counter-battery response time averaged under 3 minutes from detection to impact. The math was simple. Fire more than 2 or 3 rounds from any position, and you died. Displace constantly, and you couldn't sustain effective fire. Don't fire at all, and you weren't artillery anymore, just expensive equipment hiding in the woods. The Germans chose constant displacement, survival over effectiveness. They became hunted animals running from position to position, firing a handful of rounds and fleeing before the sky opened up. The loader's hands are still on the shell casing when the first American round detonates 40 meters short. He doesn't process what's happening. His body does, dropping flat before his brain catches up. The second salvo lands closer. The third lands on the gun pit. Monte Cassino rose 1,400 feet above the Liri Valley, and every German artillery officer who studied the terrain understood what that meant. Perfect observation. Interlocking fields of fire. Positions carved into reverse slopes where direct observation from below was physically impossible. The Americans couldn't see these guns. That was the point. German batteries on the heights could fire down into the valley, adjust onto targets with contemptuous precision, then sit untouchable behind rock and elevation, while American counter-battery teams search for positions they'd never locate. The mountain was supposed to be a fortress. The guns were supposed to be invisible. They were invisible. It didn't matter. January 1944. A German battery of 10.5-centimeter howitzers occupies a position on the northern slope of Monte Cassino, supporting the Gustav Line defenses. Good position. Excellent position. The guns sit in reinforced pits with overhead cover, protected from direct fire by the shoulder of the mountain itself. American infantry in the valley can't see them. American forward observers can't get line of sight. The battery commander feels secure enough to conduct sustained fire missions. Not the nervous 2-round salvos other units have adopted, but proper concentrations, 8 rounds per gun, the kind of fires that actually suppress enemy movement. The battery fires its first volley at 09:17 hours. American counter-battery arrives at 09:19. Not approximate, not in the vicinity. The first American shells land within 50 meters of the gun line. The second salvo walks directly across the position. The battery loses 2 guns and 11 men before anyone can react. The survivors abandon the remaining pieces and scramble for cover, and for the next 4 hours, American artillery pounds their empty position into rubble while they watch from a ravine 300 meters away. The battery commander's after-action report, captured later and translated by American intelligence, contains a phrase that shows up again and again in German documents from this sector. Unerklärlich schnell, inexplicably fast. He'd done everything right. Reverse slope position, no visual exposure, proper dispersion between guns. His men were veterans. His procedures were textbook. None of it mattered, because the Americans weren't looking for his guns. They were listening. The mountain that hid him from eyes couldn't hide him from microphones planted in the valley floor. A different battery, same sector, 3 weeks later. This crew has heard what happened to the Cairo position. They've adapted. Shorter fire missions, faster displacement drills. They fire 4 rounds and immediately begin limbering. Halfway through the displacement, guns still hooked to prime movers, crews climbing onto vehicles. American shells bracket the position. The rounds catch them in motion, scattered between the old firing point and their intended route. 3 men dead, 2 vehicles, and a gun destroyed. The survivors reach their secondary position and sit there for 6 hours, too rattled to fire again. A third battery tries night operations exclusively. Fire only after dark, when flash observation should be impossible, when the terrain provides additional concealment. They fire their first mission at 22:30 hours. American counter battery arrives at 22:32. The battery commander realizes, perhaps for the first time, that darkness means nothing to microphones. The pattern repeated across the casino sector throughout the winter of 43 and the spring of 44. German batteries that should have dominated from their positions learned to fear their own guns. Each round fired announced their location. Each volley invited destruction. The terrain that promised protection became irrelevant because protection required not being seen, and seeing had nothing to do with how the Americans found them. German artillery effectiveness in the casino sector dropped by measurable increments as the campaign progressed, not because they lost guns. Replacements arrived regularly. Not because crews lacked training. These were experienced Eastern Front veterans. They lost effectiveness because effective artillery requires sustained fire, and sustained fire was suicide. A battery that fires 3 rounds and runs accomplishes almost nothing. Adjusting fire requires observation, correction, additional rounds, and suppression requires volume. Destruction requires concentration. All of these require staying in position long enough to deliver meaningful fires, and staying in position meant dying. By March, some German batteries had adopted what their own officers called survival fire. Single rounds from constantly shifting positions, never enough to accomplish any tactical purpose, just enough to prove the guns still existed. Artillery reduced to gestures. The abbey on the mountain would become the campaign's symbol, what people remember. Below it, in positions that should have been impregnable, German gunners learned a lesson their doctrine had never anticipated. The best terrain in the world means nothing when firing your weapon is what kills you. Feuer und Flucht, fire and flight. The phrase appears in a German artillery manual supplement distributed along the Italian front in early 1944. Not a suggestion, not tactical guidance for unusual circumstances, standing doctrine. The manual instructed battery commanders to prepare displacement routes before firing the first round, to limit fire missions to 4 rounds maximum, regardless of tactical requirements, and to begin movement within 60 seconds of the final discharge. Any commander who held position longer bore personal responsibility for the consequences. The word used for consequences was Vernichtung, annihilation. This was surrender, dressed as adaptation. German artillery doctrine had been built on precision and concentration. Register the guns on the target, deliver sustained fires until it ceased to exist. A proper suppression mission required dozens of rounds per gun. Destruction of fortified positions required hundreds. Interdiction of supply routes required constant harassment over hours. None of this was possible under the new doctrine. 4 rounds told you almost nothing about where your shells were landing. Not enough to adjust or correct, barely enough to confirm you were hitting the right grid square. German batteries were reduced to firing blind and hoping, then running before they could learn whether they'd accomplished anything. The men knew what this meant, even if the manual didn't say it directly. A loader in a battery near Anzio described the new rhythm in a letter home that was later captured. Wake before dawn. Prepare the gun. Move to the firing position in darkness. Wait for the fire mission. 4 rounds, and he emphasizes the number, underlines it, then immediately hook the gun to the half-track while the barrel is still hot. Drive to the secondary position. Wait. Sometimes fire again. Sometimes not. Move to the 3rd position before dark. Sleep in a different place than the night before. Repeat. He writes that he could no longer remember what it felt like to fire a proper mission. His hands know the load and drill, but the rhythm is wrong now. Load, fire, run. Load, fire, run. He compares it to being a man who owns a hammer, but is forbidden to swing it more than once. The Eastern Front veterans understood the loss most acutely. They had fought Soviet artillery, massed, brutal, but slow to respond. A German battery on the steppes could fire for 10 minutes, adjust onto a target, destroy it, then displace before Soviet counter-battery found the range. They had been hunters. Now they were prey that occasionally bit back. Some battery commanders resisted the new doctrine. One, whose name appears in American intelligence summaries as Hauptmann W., refused to adopt the 4-round limit during operations near the Rapido River in February. His battery was supporting an infantry assault, and 4 rounds meant nothing against prepared American positions. He ordered sustained fire, proper concentrations, the kind of support his infantry needed, 12 rounds per gun. The mission lasted 4 minutes. American counter-battery arrived at minute 3. The battery lost every gun and 60% of its personnel. Hauptmann W. survived. His after-action report, translated and filed by American intelligence, contains a single remarkable admission. He had known the response would come, had calculated the time, had chosen to accept the casualties because the alternative was watching his infantry die unsupported. He was asking his superiors to choose between 2 kinds of failure. They chose survival. They chose ineffectiveness. By the spring of '44, German artillery in Italy had become a force that existed primarily to prove it still existed. Batteries fired their 4 rounds to show the Americans they were present, then fled to positions they hoped hadn't been plotted. Fire missions that required concentration went unsupported because concentration required time, and time meant death. American infantry advancing up the Italian peninsula faced machine guns and mortars and small arms, but the artillery that should have torn them apart before they reached the wire was firing 4 rounds and running. The American infantry didn't know why the German guns had gone quiet. They knew only that the bombardments were shorter now, less accurate. They knew that attacks which should have been preceded by hours of preparation fire came behind a handful of shells that landed scattered across the landscape. They knew, without understanding the mechanism, that something had broken inside the German artillery arm. What had broken was the ability to function as artillery at all. A gun that cannot fire for effect is not a weapon. It is a liability, something to be protected, fed, transported, maintained, all for the privilege of firing 4 rounds and fleeing. German logistics continued supplying ammunition that could never be expended, replacement guns that would never fire proper missions, trained crews that spent more time driving than shooting. The cost of American counter-battery extended far beyond the guns actually destroyed. It reached the shells sitting in dumps unfired and the missions that went unsupported. It reached every infantryman who died because the artillery that should have protected him was already on a road somewhere, running from microphones it couldn't see. The guns that survived cost Germany more than the guns that died. A destroyed battery disappears from the logistics chain. No more ammunition shipments, no more replacement parts, no more fuel for prime movers, no more rations for crews that no longer exist. The loss is finite, calculable, a single entry in a ledger. But a battery that survives under American counter-battery dominance remains in the system, demanding supplies, consuming transportation capacity, requiring maintenance, while delivering almost nothing in return. Every shell shipped to a gun that will fire 4 rounds and flee is a shell that could have fed a weapon capable of sustained operations. Every trained artilleryman driving a half-track down escape routes is a man not serving the guns. The German army in Italy maintained its artillery strength on paper, while watching its artillery effectiveness collapse in practice, and the gap between those two realities consumed resources that might have mattered elsewhere. The British learned this arithmetic the hard way in North Africa, though the context differed. Rommel's Africa Corps had faced British artillery that could mass fires effectively, but lacked the detection systems to find hidden guns reliably. German batteries in the desert survived by concealment and maneuver, not by limiting their own effectiveness. They could still function as artillery. The American system in Italy imposed a different calculus entirely. Not hide well and you'll survive, but fire effectively and you'll die. The British had played chess. The Americans played a game where moving your pieces destroyed them. By mid-1944, German artillery commanders in Italy faced an impossible choice every time a fire mission came down: support the infantry properly and lose the battery, preserve the battery and watch the infantry die unsupported. Some chose one way, some the other, but the choice itself was the American victory. An artillery arm paralyzed by its own survival instinct has already lost, regardless of how many guns remain operational. The smell of cordite hung in the air for hours after a battery displaced. That sharp chemical bite that clung to uniforms and skin, that announced guns fired here to anyone with a functioning nose. German crews learned to hate that smell. It meant they'd been somewhere too long, done something too loud, left a signature that might still be readable when American shells arrived at the position they just abandoned. Some crews reported washing their faces with dirt to mask the scent, as if the Americans were tracking them by smell rather than sound. They weren't. But the paranoia was its own form of victory. A German NCO captured near Anzio in April. 44 provided interrogators with a phrase that summarized everything. Wir schießen nicht mehr, wir deuten nur noch an. We don't shoot anymore, we only hint. The distinction matters. Hinting at artillery support, a few shells to show the guns exist, accomplishes nothing tactically. It suppresses no enemy positions, destroys no fortifications, interdicts no supply routes, breaks up no forming attacks. Effective artillery requires volume and accuracy sustained over time. Everything the German system could no longer provide. American infantry advancing against positions that should have been pre-registered killing grounds found those positions defended by machine guns and rifles and courage, but not by the massed fires that had made German defensive doctrine so lethal in earlier campaigns. The artillery was there. It simply couldn't do its job. German infantry commanders understood what they'd lost, even if they couldn't articulate the mechanism. Request fire support. Receive 4 rounds. Watch the guns flee. Request sustained fires. Receive nothing. The batteries had already displaced to avoid the response that would follow. Request preparation fires before an assault. Receive a handful of shells scattered across a beaten zone too large to suppress anything. The coordination between infantry and artillery that German doctrine demanded had become physically impossible under American counter-battery dominance, and the men at the guns felt it most directly. The weight of a 105 shell is roughly 33 pounds. A loader handles that weight dozens of times during a proper fire mission. The rhythm of lift, seat, ram, step clear becoming automatic, almost meditative. 4 rounds breaks that rhythm before it begins. The muscles remember what sustained fire feels like. The body expects it. 4 rounds, and then the scramble to displace leaves the loader's arms still ready for shells that won't come. The gunner's hands still on elevation wheels that won't turn again until the next position, the next 4 rounds, the next flight. They had become artillerymen forbidden to practice artillery. The American counter-battery system didn't need to destroy every German gun in Italy. It needed to make every German gun in Italy afraid to function. The fear was rational and inescapable, beyond what courage or training could overcome, and it accomplished what direct destruction never could. It turned a tactical asset into a psychological liability, a weapon into a target that occasionally shot back. The radio operator is transcribing coordinates when he realizes the pattern. 3 separate German batteries have fired in the last 11 minutes. 3 separate American responses have already gone out. He hasn't moved from his chair. The Fire Direction Center hasn't raised its voice. The system processes German fire missions faster than German crews can limber their guns, and somewhere across the valley, men are dying for information they gave away the moment they pulled their lanyards. The strategic irony cuts deeper than casualties or destroyed equipment. The American counter-battery system had achieved something unprecedented in the history of artillery warfare. It had made the enemy's weapons work against him. Every German shell that left a tube carried 2 payloads. One was high explosive aimed at American positions. The other was acoustic and seismic data aimed at German positions. The first might miss, the second never did. German artillery commanders understood firepower. They understood logistics, terrain, concentration, all the classical elements of their arm. What they never fully grasped was that they had entered an information war they couldn't win. The Americans had built a machine that converted German aggression into German coordinates. Fire around. Surrender your location. Keep firing. Die. The calculus was that simple and that inescapable. A Wehrmacht assessment from late '44, written for internal consumption, never intended for American eyes, attempted to quantify the disparity. American counter-battery response averaged under 3 minutes from first detection to first rounds on target. German counter-battery response, when it functioned at all, averaged between 12 and 18 minutes. The report notes that this gap was not primarily technological. German sound-ranging equipment worked. German observers could spot muzzle flashes. The difference was systemic. The speed at which information moved from detection to decision to execution. American fire direction centers processed data, while German liaison officers were still reaching for telephones. By the time German commanders finished plotting coordinates, American batteries had already received them. German authorization requests were still climbing the chain of command when American shells hit. Speed multiplied every American advantage and negated every German countermeasure. The few German attempts to match the American system failed for reasons that went beyond equipment. One experimental counter-battery section near Cassino achieved detection times comparable to American units. They could locate a firing battery within 90 seconds. But translating detection into response required coordination across divisional boundaries, artillery group approval, ammunition allocation, fire mission assignment. By the time German shells reached the American position, the American guns had fired, displaced, and set up again. The Germans had built a fast eye attached to slow hands. American hands moved at the speed of the system itself. May 1944. The Gustav Line breaks. German forces begin their withdrawal north toward the Gothic Line, and the artillery that should have covered that retreat can barely function. Batteries move by night, set up in new positions, fire their 4 rounds at pursuing American columns, displace before the response arrives. They accomplish nothing except announcing their presence. American infantry advances against resistance that should have been stiffened by massed fires and finds instead scattered shells landing without pattern or purpose. A German artillery officer captured during the retreat provided American interrogators with a clinical assessment of what his arm had become. He had commanded a battery of 15-centimeter howitzers, heavy guns capable of devastating effect against infantry in the open. In the final weeks of the Cassino campaign, his battery expended fewer than 60 rounds total. Not per day. Total. They had ammunition, functioning guns, trained crews. What they lacked was the ability to use any of it without dying. He described the experience of watching American aircraft spot his position, calling in coordinates that brought American artillery within 4 minutes. He described displacing to a secondary position and finding American shells waiting when he arrived. The Americans had plotted his likely routes and pre-registered the intersections. He described finally ordering his men to dig in and wait rather than fire, because firing meant detection, and detection meant death. His battery survived the campaign largely intact. 4 guns, 16 men, 60 rounds expended over 11 weeks, an artillery unit that had functioned as a very expensive hole in the ground. The interrogator's notes indicate the officer spoke without emotion, stating facts as facts. At the end of the session, he offered a single observation that the translator rendered into English and underlined. We had artillery. You had artillery that could think,